Hare Krishna devotees. So today's shloka for the day is shloka number 28 of chapter 6. Yunjannevam sadatmanam yogi vigata kalmashaha sukhena brahma sparsham atyantam sukhamashnute. Yunjannevam sadatmanam yogi vigata kalmashaha sukhena brahma samsparsham atyantam sukhamashnute. Yunjannevam sadatmanam yogi vigata kalmashaha sukhena brahma samsparsham atyantam sukhamashnute. Please recite after me. Yunjannevam sadatmanam
Yunjannevam sadatmanam
yogi vigata kalmashaha
yogi vigata kalmashaha
sukhena brahma samsparsham
sukhena brahma samsparsham
atyantam sukhamashnute.
atyantam sukhamashnute.
Yunjannevam sadatmanam
Yunjannevam sadatmanam
yogi vigata kalmashaha
yogi vigata kalmashaha
sukhena brahma samsparsham
sukhena brahma samsparsham
atyantam sukhamashnute.
atyantam sukhamashnute.
Yunjannevam sadatmanam
Yunjannevam sadatmanam
yogi vigata kalmashaha
yogi vigata kalmashaha
sukhena brahma samsparsham
sukhena brahma samsparsham
atyantam sukhamashnute.
atyantam sukhamashnute.
Word for word meaning and translation by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Yunjan, engaging in yoga practice.
Engaging in yoga practice.
Evam, thus. Sada, always. Atmanam, the self. Yogi, one who is in touch with the Supreme Self.
One who is in touch with the Supreme Self.
Vigata, freed from. Kalmashaha, all material contamination. Sukhena, transcendental happiness. Brahma samsparsham, being in constant touch with the Supreme. Atyantam, the highest. Sukham, happiness. Ashnute, attains. Translation. Thus, the self-controlled yogi constantly engaged in yoga practice becomes free from all material contamination
becomes free from all material contamination
and achieves the highest stage
and achieves the highest stage
of perfect happiness
of perfect happiness,
in transcendental loving service to the Lord.
transcendental loving service to the Lord.
So yesterday we were talking about how the mind naturally runs towards Krishna when the mind becomes attached to Krishna. So the mind can become attached to Krishna once your mode of passion is subdued. Then your mind becomes serene, and when your mind is serene, it has a natural affection developing for Krishna as long as you are doing all of your sadhana, right? And we talked about how the devotee always sees the Lord, always hears about the Lord, always speaks about the Lord, and thus is always thinking of the Lord. So the Lord talked about the glimpse of progress. The symptom of progress is this transcendental bliss. So today here, the Lord is talking about how in such a blissful state, one is constantly engaged in yoga practice. So this is not something that is fleeting in nature, the practice, I mean. So this practice has to be constant. You cannot have a stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, or start, stop, however you want to look at it. It has to be sustained. It has to be constant. One cannot let go. As Prabhupada says, the minute you remove an iron rod from the fire, even though that iron rod retains the heat and fire-like qualities, it does immediately begin to cool down. So one must always keep that iron rod in the fire if you wanted to attain the qualities of that fire. So here, if we want to attain the qualities of that Brahma Samsparsham, that is, you are always in contact with the Supreme Lord. There's no other option. So if you're always in contact with the Supreme Lord, then naturally you're going to be freed from all kinds of material contamination, and you're always achieving this highest form of bliss. So in Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 11th canto, in the 25th chapter and the 29th shloka, there is a shloka that talks about 4 kinds of happiness. What are these 4 kinds of happiness? The first one is tamasic happiness. You may ask, how can anybody be happy when they are under the influence of tamogun? But everybody finds something that they rest their happiness on, so-called happiness on. So the tamasic happiness is derived from sleep, from alcohol, from narcotics, from violence. So those individuals who are predominantly under the influence of the tamogun actually experience satisfaction and happiness through these means. Then that shloka talks about rajasic happiness. So the happiness that is derived from satisfying your senses through the objects of the senses and the mind is rajasic happiness. So if the mind says do this, or if the mouth says have this, or the ear says hear this, or the eyes say watch this, all of this has nothing to do with spirituality. This is rajasic pleasure. So what about sattvic pleasure? Sattvic pleasure or happiness comes from being virtuous. So all of the good qualities that you acquire, being kind, being compassionate, being simple, all the Brahmanical qualities, You get pleasures from simply being virtuous and doing the right thing. So what happens is that you have a tendency to acquire knowledge in this state, and your mind becomes still. And the stage of self-realization is actually experienced by those who follow the path of Jnana Yoga. So they do achieve self-realization while they are in this stage of sattvic happiness. But we know what is the problem with sattvic happiness. Sattvic happiness tells you that you're too satisfied with life. You're too knowledgeable, therefore you don't need to seek anything more beyond that knowledge. Therefore, even this sattvic happiness is limiting. And then the fourth kind of happiness that this Bhagavatam shloka talks about is nirguna happiness. This is actually happiness in connection with the divine. This happiness is infinite and keeps growing and growing and growing. So one can experience unlimited bliss when we are connected with the Supreme Lord. So our source of bliss is unending because that supreme source of bliss is also unending. So if we want unending, uninterrupted bliss, we should always be connected with the Supreme Lord. So that is why the Lord is using the word here, constantly engaged, always. Not only when you want to experience it, you never unplug from the source of power. This is a self-controlled yogi who knows the secret to never-ending, ever-expanding, transcendental bliss.